you so much for joining us this evening for what I know is going to be a really fascinating discussion about human trafficking and detecting human trafficking past and future. We have a fantastic panel of participants in this webinar, and in a minute I'm going to introduce to you our moderator for the panel, who is also someone with expertise on human trafficking as well. Before I do that, I just want to say that this has been approved for CLE credit, continuing legal education credit. I will be posting the event number that you need to get CLE credit at the end of the webinar. And this has also been approved for 1 hour of continuing education ACAMS credit. As we proceed, we will have time for question and answer at the end of the lecture or the discussion, but you can also type questions as we go into the chat, and I'll be monitoring that for questions to pose to our panel. So,
I'm sorry, Kathy, in the Q&A, not the chat, please.
Sorry, the Q&A. Forgive me. Post in the Q&A. Thanks, Patty. This is part of our course in the Master of Arts in Financial Integrity program, which, as you all know, is offered at Case Western Reserve Law School. And we're delighted to open this discussion tonight up not only to our MAFI students, but to the rest of you. You can find out more information about the MAFI program on Case Western Reserve Law School's website. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panel moderator. Our panel moderator is Dan Polar, and Dan is responsible for defining strategies in the United States and Canada that deliver innovative compliance technology combined with comprehensive financial intelligence that enable financial institutions and corporate clients to efficiently and effectively comply with relevant governmental regulations. And he does that through LexisNexis Risk Solutions. Dan is also a member of our MAFI faculty and has just been a delightful addition to our faculty and helped with many pieces already. So Dan, my personal thanks, and I'm going to turn the webinar over to you.
Thank you, Kathy. I appreciate that. Welcome to everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. We have a great program for you and a stellar panel of industry experts that will enlighten you on the work they've done and continue to do to combat human trafficking. Our first speaker is Maya Simic. Maya is a clinical law professor and co-director of the Case Western Reserve Health and Human Trafficking Clinic. She also serves as managing legal director of Equality Ohio, where she's developed and is now supervising a statewide legal clinic for the LGBTQ+ community. Maya focuses her practice on legal issues impacting the LGBTQ+ community, human trafficking prevention, and victim redress. Her other areas of interest include community lawyering and the importance of interdisciplinary collaboration, particularly with social services, on the efficacy of legal practice. The focus on these areas of interest inspired Maya's spearheading of a law clinic for individuals affected by HIV and AIDS, engaging in case management services at the Nueva Luz Urban Resource Center in 2012. Maya earned her law degree in 2010 from the Cleveland Marshall College of Law, her MSSA in 2007 from Case Western Reserve's Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences, and her BS in the year 2000 from John Carroll University. Maya is admitted to the bar in Ohio and California, and she's an Ohio licensed independent social worker with supervision designation. Maya's presentation is titled Human Trafficking and Overview. Maya, we're honored to have you with us this evening. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dan. Okay, so as we said, today I am going to start off doing a little bit of human trafficking as an overview, and we're going to go through kind of the story that we tell, or the way that we are looking at human trafficking, how we are going through the process of defining trafficking by the law, what some of the general characteristics of survivors look like, and then the way in which interdisciplinary collaboration plays an important role in how we all work together in addressing human trafficking as an issue. And so I work at the Health and Human Trafficking Law Clinic at Case Western Reserve, and we provide opportunities for individuals who are both legal and social work students to work on the provision of services to sex and labor trafficking survivors, as well as individuals who are at high risk for sex and labor trafficking, as identified by characteristics such as having a substance use disorder, being a member of the LGBTQ community, or not having citizenship in the United States. We also focus on trainings and prevention or presentation, within the community, as well as legislative research on issues that impact members of the populations we're working with. So to start off, when we're looking at human trafficking statistics, wanted to go through the process of explaining how this conversation shapes who we think are trafficking survivors, who we're hitting, who we're missing, and just kind of get a sense of what we look at when we're looking at these different kinds of cases. And so we are going to identify some of the statistics that are coming to us from a national human trafficking hotline, what law enforcement investigations in Ohio tell us about the trafficking numbers, as well as how the federal prosecution of some cases reflect in the numbers, and then looking at some of the ways in which we're analyzing those who are at high risk for trafficking. So looking at this, every year there's a report that's issued, and the report tells us something along the lines of this state is the number X in the nation of cases reported for human trafficking. And what that tends to be is it is a study that is actually done from a national partner organization called Polaris, one of the leads of trafficking in the country. And they have actually a national trafficking hotline, and that trafficking hotline reports calls. And the calls that come in are how they designate which state is actually the number X, Y, or Z in the nation of calls. And so Ohio currently has been ranked as the 5th as of 2019 in the nation, with a number of calls coming into the hotline. And you can see that they actually have a heat map that shows where those cases are coming in from, as well as how many contacts there are since the year 2007, where the cases are breakdown of sex and labor trafficking. And so it's an important item to know as these studies comes out, who do we think are actually going through the process of calling in, and who are we missing and who are we getting is a question that I like to frame when we're looking at some of these numbers. But up in the top right corner of the screen, you can also see that some of the other states that have the highest ranks of numbers calling into this hotline, California, Texas, Florida, and New York, are above Ohio, but the highest, California, being 1,500 calls that are coming in. And so as we pause there, Ohio having 450, California having 1,500, how does that land in terms of how you think about trafficking? Is it more? Is it less? And what does that actually tell us? So in terms of Ohio being 5th in the nation, we like to sit and think about some of those contributing factors that help trafficking to be the prevalence rate that it is. And so looking at Ohio, when we are analyzing why trafficking might be a little bit more prevalent than other areas, we have identified that there is a highway system that provides ease of access both across the state from north to south, as well as east to west, which opens up to the rest of the country with ease of transporting goods and individuals. We have a high rural community with large temporary populations. We have a large immigrant population. We have a problem with substance use in Ohio, and as well as we have a northern border that doesn't have a lot of access or check marks between Canada and the United States. So a lot of individuals are able to provide access in a different way that don't necessarily have the same security checks. And so these are some of the reasons that there is anticipated to be higher rates of trafficking in Ohio that contribute to the prevalence rates. But is this a good thing or a bad thing, right? So some of these are some of the weaknesses that Ohio perhaps has, or contributing factors. Some of the strengths, though, as to why Ohio has a higher number in this Polaris study is that we actually have been having a lot of educational campaigns over the past decade for organizations such as, let's say, the Collaborative to End Human Trafficking, doing billboard signs and campaigns, providing access to information around what human trafficking is, as well as places where to call in, which we see as a good thing. And so the number of cases coming up actually has a positive side to it that we like to consider as well, meaning that people are knowing more information about human trafficking. So when looking at another study, the Attorney General of Ohio presents a different picture of how many cases are being investigated by law enforcement officers across the state. And so we can see that in 2019, looking at some of these statistics, it was reported that there were 251 different investigations, which led to 166 arrests and 56 successful convictions in the state of Ohio. Looking at what some of these factors are for people who are identified as survivors, you can see there's a breakdown of sex, there's a breakdown of race, and there's a breakdown of age. And what I always encourage people to do when they're thinking about human trafficking is to just stop and pause. And if you close your eyes, who are you thinking of when you're thinking of human trafficking survivor? And if you're looking at these different demographics, does that match, or are there some challenges to your perspective when you close your eyes around who you think a survivor is versus who you're seeing here? What versions in terms of the age in particular, in terms of the sex, you're seeing that there are men and women, that there are ages, and the racial demographic breakdown. Any of those that are surprising to you, challenge yourself to start considering different ways of looking at what a survivor does look like. Other factors that are important to note here in terms of the Attorney General ranks also the ways in which people identify how they were brought into trafficking and factors that contributed to why they were being trafficked. And we can see here as well that drugs and alcohol or other dependency issues is rated as one of the highest factors, followed after with oppression, marginalization, or being impoverished. The Attorney General then also goes on and talks about what it looks like for a trafficker, and same question, right? So the question being, what do you think of when you're thinking of someone who is human trafficked, a human trafficker? Is it a man? Is it a woman? What is the age range? Some of the things that I think are important to look at here is that we are seeing increasingly younger individuals that are actually being brought up on convictions for trafficking. And we can see here in 2019, we actually had 2 individuals who were under the age of 18, which may be a surprise to you. We also are seeing both men and women listed. And so it's just one of the things that I also ask people to consider is how you think a trafficker looks versus what we start seeing some of the pictures. In terms of prosecution rates, we are seeing that in terms of federal prosecutions across the state, that there were 145 new cases in 2019, which led to 339 convictions and took on average around cases that were ongoing 27 months to complete. However, what it doesn't tell you in this chart, but when you start looking at them moving forward, is that there is actually only 4 cases in the entire state of Ohio that came in as new cases. And so when we started hearing some of the prior cases from the Attorney General to now, you can see that there must be a difference between whether we're going through state prosecution or federal prosecution, as well as why is it so few number of cases that are actually coming into federal, and what does that look like for us, and what are we doing that we may want to be considering we should be doing differently. And the last study that I like to bring up, which I think changes a little bit of what we're actually thinking about when we're thinking of trafficking, is there was a recent study that was done out of the University of Cincinnati, which actually says that by looking at 14 different data sites across the state, that they found that there were 1,030 Ohio juveniles who were the victims of human trafficking between the years of 2014 and 2016. But then they took it a step further and identified that there were 4,200 youths who were at risk of being trafficked. And what that went on to say is that they believe that those numbers, even though they're higher than other numbers in other studies that we are seeing, they're actually considered to be fairly conservative due to the fact that they said that there were a lot of agencies that were unwilling or unable to provide data due to privacy or other reasons. And so those cases went unreported. And so as we're looking at all of the ways in which we're identifying trafficking survivors, I want to give just pause to think about what at risk means and how we're giving screening factors attention to those individuals who are at higher risk for trafficking. So
Maya, there was a couple questions that we had so far. Is it okay if we were to stop for a second and ask?
Oh, sure.
So there was a question about how do the call-in numbers look as a normalized number, like calls per 100,000 state citizens? We wanted to go back and just touch on that for a minute.
Oh, Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm not sure that I know how to address that one, Mr. Moody, but I can get back to you on that one.
Okay. And then we had there was no number for Latinos. Were they considered white in the study?
Yes, so either other or white in terms of the way that they were collecting the data. Unfortunately, there was not a specific category for ethnicity, including like Latinx or Hispanic in the study.
Okay. Thank you.
So continuing on, just going into how the law defines trafficking, the federal law actually, so this is a new problem, and the way that we're actually looking at the law in general is within the past 21 years that the United States has started talking about a comprehensive federal law to address human trafficking. And so as we are actually looking into this, it's relatively new for us. And so how we're telling the story, how we're identifying folks, and where we need to grow is because we are just relatively learning as we go. And so the federal law focuses on a three-pronged approach of prevention, protection, and prosecution. And it uses an AMP model, meaning action, means, and purpose is how we are identifying trafficking. And so looking here, it is, we are using the actions of inducing, recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining, and someone doing these with force by means of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of engaging in commercial sex or in labor services is how the federal law is defining trafficking.
Maya, we had a question about the map. In regard to the map, could you explain sex work only? Is it prostitution, strip clubs, massage parlors, or a specific genre?
Wonderful. Yep. So we are actually getting into the definition in Ohio right now. And so in Ohio, the way that we define sex trafficking actually encompasses all of those. And so it's obscenity or sex related or nudity related are all portions of how Ohio law defines human trafficking. So the AMP model for Ohio law for human trafficking right here. So here are the actions that we talk about when we're looking at the state of Ohio in general. And so we have luring, harboring, transporting, maintaining, providing, isolating, enticing, and recruiting. And these are the ways in which we look to see if someone has engaged in, if the offender knows that the other person will be subjected to involuntary servitude, labor trafficking, or if they would be involved in the engagement of sexual activity for hire, a performance that is obscene, sexually oriented, or nudity oriented, or a model or participant in the production of material that is obscene. So as you can see, the last question we talked about, Ohio has a three-pronged tier of what it considers to be sex trafficking, that it could be any one of those prongs. And that study does not break them out specifically, but it is a thought to encompass any one of those three. So looking back at labor trafficking, you can also see that it is the compulsion of labor or services against a will, but it doesn't define it a lot more than that. And so just stopping and thinking about what labor trafficking is, we don't have a conversation a lot about how labor trafficking is also something that can be not legal, can be something that looks like it should be occurring. And so we actually have a really hard time understanding and seeing labor trafficking because of the fact we don't give a lot of conversation to it, and it often looks like it should be there. Both elements have something called compulsion in it. And compulsion is important to this definition because it notes that in the state of Ohio, it does not require trafficking to be openly displayed or physically exerted, but for compulsion to have been established in Ohio, so this is the means parallel for the federal definition, force, fear, duress, intimidation, or fraud are the ways in which compulsion can be established.
Maya, we had a question for you. Are you seeing a correlation between webcamming, like OnlyFans, and human trafficking? And if so, could you share any additional information on that, please?
Absolutely. So we have been seeing increasingly more usage of webcams as well as Facebook, Instagram, social media, and different electronic means for the engagement of trafficking. And actually, that's a way in which technology and financial facets, which we'll talk about a little bit later with some of the colleagues in the presentation, are looking to expand how we're watching and monitoring for trafficking in the community. And I can see which
one more question.
Which county has the greatest amount of sex trafficking criminal convictions, and what Ohio has the greatest documented sex trafficking incidents as defined by me? Well, so if you look at the map as it's called into for the Polaris call-in, you see a lot of activity around the 3 Cs as well as in Toledo. So the 3 Cs being Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati. And we see a lot of parallels with things such as missing person reports that are in those areas as well. But we also don't know around what reporting looks like in other areas, how that information is translated, what the knowledge of human trafficking looks like outside of the urban settings. And so I can tell you the report numbers are higher, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the rates are lower. It's just who we're getting to report that we are seeing. So going back quickly to what it looks like in terms of this definition section, we can see that, again, these are some of the ways in which we are looking at what human trafficking looks like under the law for sex and labor trafficking. And the ways in which we are seeing some of the changes of conversation are a focus I'd like to talk about for the elements in particular of enticing or providing. So enticing being a if you do this, then I will do this for you. And if you don't do this, I won't do this for you. And so there's an element of that coercion that we've spoken of that ends up being prevalent around the provision of something that someone has a positional power and need for, such as drugs, a place to stay, food, that we are seeing an exchange that is lending itself to trafficking with greater prevalence than individuals don't necessarily know or have that conversation around. Providing is something we also see where someone has positional authority over someone and then provides them or in order for the purposes of sex trafficking in particular. And we're seeing more and more parents being convicted of the provision under the provision element. So as we're thinking about how we're working together and what our risk factors are and what we should be doing around the community involvement, trying to look at some of the characteristics of individuals who have been survivors of sex and labor trafficking. And we can see that overall, some of the general characteristics are previous history of mental health or abuse, with particular sexual abuse or domestic violence, overlaps with poverty and homelessness, as well as substance use. And then with minors, we can see some of also the higher risk factors include individuals who have identified within the LGBTQ community, who have been involved in juvenile justice systems and or in foster care. And I like to present these elements because as we're thinking about what it looks like to be doing outreach or trying to design models in which we are ensuring that trafficking is being addressed, how are we intersecting with some of the populations that we know are most at risk becomes something that should be at the forefront of the conversation. So teamwork and interdisciplinary collaboration means that's how we're actually working to get the job done, right? And so it can't just be lawyers, it can't just be financiers, it can't just be tech gurus or social service folks. It's all of us together working in tandem in order to make this happen. And so most recently, an example of this collaboration, which will be the platform by which we go into the my colleagues' conversations, we had an operation that was hosted by the Ohio Attorney General Office, as well as over 50 different organizations across the state in order to address sex trafficking and try to identify individuals who were survivors of human trafficking, who were missing and or exploited children, and or trying to find people who are interested in trying to purchase sex with specificity, individuals who were looking to have sex with underage minors. And so during this procedure, the individuals work together, social service agencies, individuals testing for HIV and STIs, mental health counselors, SANE nurses who are sexual assault nurse examiners, and social service workers all came together to immediately provide assistance and social service referrals, as well as information to survivors that were found during the course of events. And these events were screenings done by law enforcement agencies for pages where individuals were looking to purchase sex. And as a result, we found 109 different trafficking survivors who were involved, as well as 76 missing and exploited cases were cleared, with 45 actual physical recoveries of different or children that were found. And this process was something by which there were a bunch of different skill sets that were being utilized in order to try to work together for the good of both identification and the provision of services and follow-up. And so we say that to say that in general, knowing what we know, trying to understand the studies, and trying to understand the risk factors, we are working together in order to try to see how we can continue to look outside of what we think maybe trafficking looks like, keep expanding our definitions and work together so that we're able to provide both prevention and then the ways to address the needs of individuals who have to go through the process of trying to get their lives back together after having been involved in a trafficking scenario. And so with that, I want to thank you for your time and turn it back over to my colleagues to talk more about what this looks like in the scope of financial and technological means. So thank you.
Thank you, Maya. We have a couple of questions maybe you can address. Is there a state or federal Good Samaritan protection for concerned reporters of potential trafficking?
I'm so sorry, I didn't hear that.
Is there a state or federal Good Samaritan protection for concerned reporters of potential human trafficking?
So are there ways in which if you report and someone else, so like a whistleblowing kind of rule?
Or just is so that the person themselves would be protected? Would the person who reports that be protected by any kind of statute? Just from a whistleblower perspective, yes.
Understand. I'm not sure about that, honestly. I know that there are different ways that agencies work and interact together. There are different like legal provisions that happen if you are trying to say, if you are a foreign national and coming into the country and you are trying to talk about something that has happened and that you were the victim of a crime. So ways to get pathways to citizenship, for example, but someone just generally reporting, I'm not as familiar with that about a protection for them.
Okay, we can follow up on that. And there's one last question for you. How would you address a non-resident alien status individual who may be victims but are afraid to approach or seek help?
That's been a really hard time. So we actually do provide assistance with T visas and U visas and asylum status for individuals who have been trafficked. And unfortunately, the immigration, the status for individuals who do not have citizenship in the United States has not been a very friendly climate over the past couple of years. And so individuals have not necessarily felt a lot of comfort and security coming forward with some of their victimization and vulnerabilities. And so it's trying to reestablish trusting bases and having the ability to provide access to, say, getting and granting some of the T visas and U visas, but that's going to take, I believe, some time to redevelop, as well as making sure that we have access to different linguistic capabilities and language lines if we don't speak those services or speak those languages in-house, and how we can keep being in communities that can see us as maybe supports as opposed to barriers or not providing a lot of assistance.
Thank you, Maya, for a great presentation and all you've done to prevent human trafficking. We're going to turn over to our next panelist. Our next panelist is Angel Nguyen Swift. Angel is the head of conduct management for Wells Fargo, where she leads a team responsible for ensuring employees act ethically on behalf of Wells Fargo, its customers and employee base. Part of the Enterprise Customer Excellence Group within the Chief Operations Office, the group provides enterprise-wide conduct functions, including the ethics program, the insider threat program, enterprise investigations, and operational reporting, supporting the company in managing conduct-related issues. Angel is an experienced leader in compliance and financial crimes with more than 18 years, helping guide financial institutions in developing, enhancing, and remediating financial crime compliance programs. Before joining Wells Fargo, she had multiple leadership, consulting, and advisory positions, including serving in senior leadership roles focused on financial crimes and compliance with American Express and Enigma Technologies. She also served as Assistant District Attorney of New York in the Identity Theft Unit, where she helped establish a team of prosecutors with expertise in and responsibility for prosecution of major cases of identity theft and cybercrime. Swift is based in New York City and is the founder and executive director of Stand Together Against Trafficking, STAT, a nonprofit organization that leverages technology and data concepts to share collaborative intelligence on financial indicators of human trafficking. She also serves on the board of directors for Polaris, the leading anti-human trafficking nonprofit organization, which is responsible for operating the U.S. National Human Trafficking Hotline and deploying data-driven strategy across the industry. She holds a Juris Doctorate from Pace University School of Law and Bachelor's of Arts in English from the University of Miami. Angel's presentation is titled Eradicating Human Trafficking Through Financial Disruption. Angel, we're honored to have you with us here tonight, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Dan and Maya. Thank you very much as well. Very excited to be here and very excited to share with you just, kind of perspectives around financial systems related to ways that we can eradicate human trafficking through financial disruption. As you could probably hear from just my background, my passion is in investigations. It's in connecting the dots, and it's in finding different ways to be able to tell and vet out truth. And how we apply that to human trafficking, I've learned throughout the years, is really through financial disruption. So what does that mean? And what can we do to kind of get there? I think about it really in 3 stages, right? First, you've got to know what the problem is. Maya just spent a lot of time just telling you what the problem is in a lot of ways, especially from the perspective of the survivor or victim or person going through the lived experience, and understanding what the problem looks like. Specifically as it relates to financial systems, knowing what the problem looks like in banks. And so once you kind of understand what that looks like, you can do something about it. Whether or not you're in a bank and you're working for a financial institution in the areas of anti-money laundering or compliance or in anti-fraud units, in the legal departments, and even the social and economic social good departments, and even in onboarding. There are business units that can also play a role in how banks and financial institutions can help eradicate human trafficking. And we'll talk a bit about that. And it really dovetails really nicely into some of the efforts that I know Maya is very familiar with, and how banks today are also taking a role in how to help victims and survivors of human trafficking come out of their lived experiences. And from there, and you'll start to hear, I think, some common themes here, we can really start to see change. And it really is through collaboration and bringing together the right people from different industries with different experiences, perspectives, details, facts, evidence, in order to actually be able to disrupt and then ultimately eradicate human trafficking through financial systems. So let's start. I mean, I won't go through a lot of the detail around defining what human trafficking is, but I will point out from a financial perspective, it is a $150 billion a year criminal industry. And that number is not just operating costs, that is profits. The number is an estimate because, as all of you are very well aware, we don't have ledgers. Excuse me. The realities of working from home. We don't have ledgers, we don't have receipts, we don't have, Excel spreadsheets that tell us exactly what's coming in and coming out, and certainly no formal platforms to talk to us about that. But there's guesstimates, estimates from a lot of data that's collected through a lot of different inputs, such as the Polaris National Hotline, but also through a plethora of other nonprofit organizations that have dedicated their purposes and mission to understanding the business of human trafficking. In terms of scope and size, there are approximately 24.9 million victims of human trafficking worldwide. This does not include, in some places internationally, human trafficking includes child marriages. If we include, child marriages and types of what some would call trafficking, the number goes up to approximately 40 million. Maya talked about the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act. These are just a lot of different efforts you'll see across the anti-human trafficking space, some facts that you may or may not have known about. We did just celebrate the 20th anniversary of the TVPA last year. If we look at instances of human trafficking, the three major countries where human trafficking occurs is the Philippines, Mexico, and the United States. Labor trafficking, which Maya also talked about, it really constitutes 71% of the victims coming in through the US legally. And so there was a question about visas, there was a question about illegal people with illegal status, and a lot of that is through the labor trafficking networks. There have been approximately 18,000 to 20,000 victims trafficked into the United States a year. I kind of double click on that because often I'm surprised that people are surprised when I talk about human trafficking that it occurs in the United States, because I think as people think about human trafficking, they often think of it as an international problem and something that doesn't happen directly in the US. So I thought that was a key point to continue to double click on. Talked a bit about the National Human Trafficking Hotline. There are just a couple of additional stats here. The Polaris, I'm obviously a little biased as I've really dedicated any sort of additional time that I have to serve on the board for Polaris, but really believe in their mission of data-driven strategies to eradicate human trafficking and really expanding the hotline to outside of the US. So it started in the US, funded by the US government, getting a lot of really great statistics, but also being able to deploy a lot of organizations to help victims real time and on the ground. And most recently, leveraging the model that Polaris has built over the last 12 years across Canada and Mexico as well. There have been also an increase in the way that law enforcement is addressing human trafficking and disrupting real time by putting in place technology that will try to deter people going onto certain websites and popping up, FYI, public service announcements across the board. So the use of technology is becoming increasingly abundant within this space. I know a lot of college students I've spoken to in Canada and Florida and in Alabama are working on different ways to leverage technology to not just deter, but to stop and eradicate activities that may be occurring online. I point out the TVPA really just to say, even back then, 20 plus now years ago, we knew that human trafficking is a network and it's a network for profit. Pointing out very specific areas where we talk about trafficking, including very specific international reach, and then being really a transnational crime that is worked through financial networks. So linking together and the ability to link together the intel we have across the board through financial systems is of utmost importance for us to be able to understand not only what trafficking looks like inside financial institutions, but then to be able to stop and detect. I won't go through AMP. Maya did a fantastic job going through that, but really, one of the kind of mission statements for a lot of nonprofits today, a lot of focus has been placed on sex trafficking, but really wanting to bring forth the understanding that labor trafficking is also and equally as prevalent. And oftentimes, as Maya's indicated, it flies under the radar because it's so hard to detect, because it goes through systems of businesses that often look legitimate on its face. So if we look at some additional work that Polaris has done, research and some analysis, you'll see that methods of control, some of which Maya has discussed previously, used on victims, the number one method of control is economic. People needing money fast, people wanting to make money fast because of their personal situations. So money really being a driver for a lot of victims getting involved, but a lot of enablers getting involved as well. So the way to get through to human trafficking and through eradication is really about financial systems, I think. Human trafficking today is high profit. You get into the business to make lots of money fast, and low risk because it's so hard to detect. So in order to eradicate human trafficking, we need to make it low profit and make it high risk. So what does that mean? That means finding ways to disrupt finances and also finding ways to help law enforcement and others really drive home and give them the ability to prosecute, detect, and hold people accountable for the activities and the roles that they play. This means roles that maybe historically may not have been flying over the radar or detected because people were claiming that they didn't know something was going on. Law enforcement, lawmakers, government, really trying to focus in on, you know what, the role of the of the trafficker isn't just right, the pimp or the recruiter, but now we're looking at enablers such as, you know, the bookkeeper, the recruiter that befriends, people who are, you know, serving as security, people who are driving, people who are chefs. You know, one prime example of that is all of the work that's being done by the survivors of Epstein, right? If you've watched any of the documentaries, there's a big emphasis on who are the other players in these large trafficking networks. So how can banks help eradicate human trafficking? I want to anchor on this. If I haven't been clear to this point, I want to make it clear now. Human trafficking is first and foremost a business. The number one goal of the business is to make money. There are lots of different types of resources that and studies that you can go to really double click on this. This was another study that was done by Polaris, and you can see here all of the different types of trafficking that have been identified on the left. There have been 25 that have been defined and published in another report, but this matrix really is about what industries do these types of trafficking touch. And as you can see, the industry that touches almost every single type of trafficking is financial services, which means in these industries, there has to be some connection to a bank, to the use of a financial product, to an ability to take money out or in, and almost every type of trafficking touches upon the financial industry. These are really just examples of other types of resources that can give you an understanding of how human trafficking and the financial system intersects and how money flows through the networks that really depend on financial systems. And there are lots of them, as you can tell. And, you know, one of my kind of missions in life is to figure out a way, and this is really the mission of STAT, Stand Together Against Trafficking, is to take all of the information that's been published in these amazing reports and distill them down to normalized, unstructured, or taking the unstructured kind of information and normalizing it in a structured way that allows us to actually garner intelligence and the ability to give financial institutions and other types of organizations the indicators and topologies that might help them detect and deter and eventually stop. I talk about how human trafficking starts in the first place. You know, I won't belabor this. I think Maya covered this quite a bit, but I will point out the economic abuse and how economic abuse really flows through financial systems, through debt bondage, why people are really lured into situations, and this is pretty prevalent in the labor trafficking space as well. And debt bondage really means, you know, the promise of a job or an opportunity to make money. But with that promise comes, you know, an ability to, an offer to take people from another country out of their circumstances, to bring them to their job, and really keeping a tab on all of the financial aspects of that. We'll pay for your travel, we'll pay for your housing, we'll pay for your clothes, we'll pay for your equipment, we'll pay for your you know, food and access to things, but you have to work for us. And we'll get you to a job that'll make you money that you can send home to your families. But after you get there, and after the person or the victim ends up in whatever job it is that they were promised, they didn't realize that by accepting the terms of that job, they were also building up a tab. So everything that a recruiter or a contracting company promises to pay for becomes debt. And so when the person or victim goes to start their job, all of their paychecks go to paying back that debt. And as they continue in their job and in their circumstances or whatever it is that they're in, the number one thing is paying for your visa, right? And paying for your ability to enter into another country legally. They end up working off a large debt before being able to actually see a paycheck that means anything themselves. And that really keeps them in a situation long enough to where a visa might run out and they have no ability to get home. And then they're really stuck and really beholden to the recruiter or contracting company that has brought them over. And there are, as I'm talking, I'm hoping everyone is thinking about, kind of checking the boxes of, oh, you're paying for housing, you're paying for, a bus fare. These are all different financial touch points that can be tracked if the context and if there's an understanding of how trafficking occurs and how these networks really, serve or how these networks run their business. So with that understanding, we're able to kind of trace the money and trace all of the kind of financial touch points back. I think this just double clicks again on what the trafficker looks like. I think the main thing the point out here is the bottom two, right? Oftentimes trafficker does not look like who you think they look like. When I first saw family members on here, I was shocked. But in a lot of different trafficking situations, that trust is built, and a lot of recruiting does come through family members. Okay, let's talk dollars and cents. There are, we talked about why it's a business and why it is, somebody might want to get into the business of trafficking. These are just a couple of numbers based on some sample cases of what a massage business would look like. This is what a network would look like. Right. We talk about per day, you're making $720, and per year, you're making $262,000. And that's, across one house. So if you've got 4 in a network, by the year, you're making $1 million in revenue. This is, just another example of how complicated and matrixed the network could be, and really how organized the network could be. And there are tabs and there are numbers attached to victims and the amount a particular victim would cost. They've come in from different countries. In this case, it was Thailand. But the way that the money is routed into the network is through wires. There are expenses that are paid through credit cards. There's money that's funneled through central bank accounts of different countries. There are apartment agreements and leases to be signed. So there are a lot of, as you're thinking about these, different ways to trace back and connect the dots. And when you kind of take a step back and see the full picture, understand what that network could look like through the financial systems. Again, another business model in terms of, dollars and cents and what the cost is of running the business and different touch points that could be leveraged in order to run the business of trafficking. And in this instance, we see a profit of over $2.8 million a year. And the cost there, and you can see the cost there of running that business. I've already talked about labor trafficking. I think, it is one of the lesser knowns. Specifically, this is, a heat map that was built based on information that we got out of a study regarding trafficking in agriculture. There are different high-end agriculture companies and businesses that are run across our country. And a lot of farms and a lot of agriculture businesses rely on recruiters and networks and contracting companies. They'll go out and they will look for laborers in a lot of different places. A lot of times the farm itself may not know where the laborers are coming from. However, we do in the US through the Department of Labor have a system in which if there are labor companies or contracting companies that apply for H-2 visas on behalf of their laborers, which often many times they do, they keep track of violations. So if you're found to underpay your workers, if you're found to have housed your workers in unlivable conditions, if you're not providing medical support for your workers, those are different violations the Department of Labor has defined. And if a particular contracting company or a recruiter has been fined for those violations, you keep track of those things, and you can end up on a debarred recruiters list. If you are debarred through the Department of Labor, then you're no longer allowed to apply for these visas. So we did a quick analysis to see, well, where are all the debarred recruiters located? And if you are familiar at all and are versed in kind of transnational crime and understanding how trafficking occurs and understanding financial networks a bit, you'll notice that all of the red dots are where at least one person or organization was debarred through the Department of Labor because of some violation. And those are all really in border states. And as I think many of us know and can probably glean, that a lot of the laborers are coming in and a lot of the money is being funneled across borders in this way. So not surprising to see, but certainly I think it was an eye-opening moment to be able to see these two data points together. And again, culminating and pulling data from and intelligence really from different sources to kind of see this on a map visually. And in the live map, you're actually able to hover over each of these dots and see names and cities and states, all, by the way, public data. Trafficking occurs, and when we think about human trafficking, sometimes we don't think about all the other things that happen. If we think about finances, if you're in one business, oftentimes you're seeing from a financial institution perspective, it linked to many other businesses. This is really just an example of how one of the largest kind of gold cases, specifically related to Elemental, which is one of, a very old company out of Ohio, parent company, was held liable for failing an AML program, an anti-money laundering program. And the impact there was they had to pay $15 million. They cannot buy and sell gold, and they've lost their reputation in terms of the value of their gold. Why am I talking about this? Well, in order to run an illegal gold mining operation, you have a lot of different touch points in many instances. And in this case, there was connections to in the gold mines and illegal mines that were found across Colombia that was connected to Elemental. There were child laborers, there was sex trafficking being brought out to the farms. We had a lot of victims being forced to service a lot of the workers that were out there because of the location and the overall kind of status of where the farms were, where the mines were. But it's all part of the network and all part of how these operations were run. Change. How do we see the change, and what does change mean? And it requires truly an ecosystem of collaboration. And really, it's about being dedicated and committed to understanding what the problem is and seeing that change through. This is just, really a depiction of the different networks that are involved and that we have leveraged and leaned on in order to understand what trafficking looks like in financial institutions in the financial system. You've got your financial institutions. We work with government, nonprofits, and law enforcement, and it really takes that collaborative ecosystem to understand how we can vet and detect financial patterns and be able to develop intelligence-based support so that we can stop financial transactions. We can make decisions on what customers to bring on board. And we can take risk-based approaches to ultimately, at the end of the day, provide financial support for survivors who are trying to make their way out of their lived situations. This is, really depicting how the power of intelligence, collaborative intelligence specifically, fits into the financial structure. So at the top here, you see kind of how trafficking occurs and how it flows through the, kind of the outside world system. An event occurs, in this case, it would be human trafficking. There's usually an investigation. Once a tip or evidence is identified, law enforcement gets involved. There's a finding. Prosecution really is, that's in parallel of prosecution. So once you have enough evidence to prosecute a case, you will go and ultimately hopefully hold the right people accountable. From the case and from the prosecution and the outcomes, you learn about what went right, what went wrong. You learn a little bit more of intelligence about a particular network or a particular system, pattern, or behavior. You take that intelligence and you build that into protocols. How can we better stop this? How can we better, prevent a victim from entering into a circumstance so that the trafficking doesn't actually occur? And then we ultimately try to find change and turn that into earlier action and ultimately find ways to prevent so that it doesn't happen in the first place. In a financial institution, you have very similar process. We identify potential patterns and behaviors that would lead to an alert. We investigate that internally through financial systems and records. We file suspicious activity reports to give law enforcement intel. And then from our work and from the processes that we develop procedures that can better vet out and identify instances of trafficking. And we can build that into proactive monitoring. So how do we, based on the learnings of investigations, build patterns learned from that? And then ultimately we can influence onboarding processes and policies, because all of this generates data. And from that data, we can really drive decisions at the corporate level to say, we've had X number of cases, X number of instances of trafficking. These businesses and these types of industries are high profile. These customers are high profile. And we can start to influence onboarding processes and policies. And then ultimately, we can prohibit the customer from even coming in to the financial system in the first place. So once you're identified as a bad company, you should not be able to enter into any financial system or any bank across the network. And then ultimately, you can also use that data to enable survivors. One of the big pain points for survivors is that they have, by the time they're able to extricate themselves from a trafficking situation, they are not able to get financial support because they at that point are deemed high risk. So if you have enough intel and have enough context around accounts, you can build the appropriate type of financial support that will enable survivors to actually get financial support to get them back on their feet again. And that's ultimately where we want to go. And that's the network that we want to build and the parallels we want to build for financial disruption of human trafficking. And this is the network and just part of the network. These are networks that I've worked with in the past. A lot of them are nonprofits. They're collaborative intelligence organizations. They're universities, law enforcement, and lots of financial institutions. We've been talking about Polaris a lot. They too have focused on financial intelligence in order to build out indicators to help financial institutions better detect and to help law enforcement better investigate. And finally, I talked a bit about STAT, but really that's about a platform to compile all of that intelligence to continue to move the effort forward, take what we've learned, put it into structured organization, and share that across the network. And if you hinted at it earlier, I was talking about the gold case, but for financial institutions, once we start to see the network of trafficking, whether it's human, whether it's drug, whether it's weapons inside institutions, it looks very similar because the money flows in a very similar manner. So once we can get to eradicating one, we can get to eradicating all. Thank you so much for your time and attention on this late evening. I'll turn it back to you, Dan.
Thank you so much for your great presentation, Angel. Angel touched on one of the items, which was typologies. And our next speaker is going to actually go into a little bit more detail on typologies. Our next speaker is Phil Deluca. Phil most recently was the Senior Vice President and Director of Compliance Controls at US Bank. I know he's recently retired, but prior to being at US Bank, Phil led the AML Investigations Department for a large global bank, where he and his team pioneered the use of issue-based typology-driven investigations. Phil has more than 30 years of financial services investigations, management experience, and has conducted and managed numerous high-profile and sensitive anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing investigations. He has partnered with all levels of law enforcement to develop leading-edge investigative strategies and has been recognized by the highest levels of government for his leadership and expertise in leveraging an issue-based investigation approach to identifying data characteristics that are potentially indicative of human trafficking. In 2012, Phil was invited to present at the White House Forum to combat human trafficking with a panel of colleagues from law enforcement and the technology industry. Phil regularly advises industry, government, and law enforcement agencies on typology development and data interrogation techniques to be more proactive and productive in detecting illicit financial activity. We're honored to have Phil join us this evening to provide us an overview of how typologies were built for the Anti-Human Trafficking Initiative at Super Bowl 52. So Phil, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate that. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we were over the first part of the presentations this evening. We talked a lot about the what. I'm going to talk a little bit about the how and the why, how banks can help and why banks want to help in this space. And then I'll lead up to the initiative of Super Bowl 52 that Dan had mentioned, and the work that we did in partnering with law enforcement around Super Bowl 52 and the numerous arrests that were made at that event. So many of you may be aware, I'm sure you are aware, that banks run transaction monitoring systems continuously to look for anomalies or erratic customer behavior. They're constantly looking at transactions, constantly trying to determine whether or not anything in those transactions would rise to the level of suspicion that would generate potentially an alert. That alert would be looked at by a number of folks within that bank, and that alert could be escalated to a case and then a SAR. We talked a little bit about that earlier in the presentation. What we did and why we did this is typically transaction monitoring systems on a good day will yield somewhere in the neighborhood of 15, will provide somewhere in the neighborhood of a 15% yield, which means that 85% of the time you're looking at a false positive. So what we tried to do is we tried to actually get to the data ourselves and exploit the data and try to identify the electronic choke point that we could identify to try to zero in on human trafficking type behavior. We called it more like fishing with a spear rather than fishing with a net. So several years ago, I interviewed a woman who was a survivor of trafficking, and she provided us with a great deal of information on types of transactions, how those transactions were made, where those transactions were made, the number of accounts that she had in her own name, so on and so forth. And that was the first inner working, if you will, of the typology that we were building. We used a pretty simple model at the time. Basically, what we wanted to do when getting into this, we wanted to, number one, do as much research as we possibly can to identify what human trafficking was, to look at cases that had been adjudicated in the system and try to determine whether or not any of those cases can be led back to our bank, where we can actually study the transaction activity in that space. to learn more about how it happens from a financial perspective. Then we actually did our data mining. Our data mining would pull in tons of transactions, and then we would begin to filter down on those transactions with the actual activity or transaction activity that we wanted to see. The next step we would focus on was the case generation and the SAR step. And while we're doing the case generation and SAR step, what we're actually doing there is feeding information back into the data mining process. The entire process is very, very iterative. Then we're building our initial typology. And in building our initial typology, what we want to be able to do is we want to think sustainability. How are we going to do this going forward, and how are we going to sustain this model that we're creating? And then we also want to feed that information back again into our transaction monitoring environment. So that's the basic model that we use. I'm going to fast forward now to, well, actually what we did during that period of time, we brought law enforcement in. HSI was a phenomenal partner through this whole process with us. They came in and talked to us for hours at a time on what human trafficking looked like from their perspective. We would take that information and then try to identify where in the systems we can actually pinpoint that activity or identify that electronic choke point. So HSI walked with us through the entire process. They believed in it, and it reaped benefits first time around. First time around, actually, that we did this, our yield was somewhere in the neighborhood of 85%. So we had flipped the model completely. Now I'm going to fast forward again to the work that we did around Super Bowl 52. I was working at U.S. Bank at the time, and it just so happened that the Super Bowl was in Minneapolis, and Minneapolis is where the bank's headquartered. So several months before, about 7 months before actually, the Super Bowl, we met with law enforcement. We explained to law enforcement up in Minneapolis what we wanted to do around the Super Bowl. They were skeptical. They were very skeptical. So our second meeting, what we actually did is we worked a few cases and brought a few cases with us of things that we had identified in our systems. They became a believer very fast. What we did is we showed them some of the activity from a financial perspective that they had already been working. They just didn't know the financial end of it. And we were able to get their attention right away. So they wanted to partner with us through the whole thing. So what we did for the Super Bowl is we gathered a number of other banks in the area. We actually worked with entities who weren't financial entities. We worked with the hotel industry, we worked with the transportation industry, and brought them into our project. Sharing was a little difficult because of the confidential activity and confidential nature of some of the activity, but we were able to openly talk about trends and things that we were seeing. So what we did is we really cordoned off 10 days prior to the event, the Super Bowl event itself. And as all of you know, I'm sure, the Super Bowl generates a ton of traffic into the area. A ton of people are coming in and out of that area at any particular time. As you may know, that type of activity is just right, or that type of movement in and out of the cities is just right for human trafficking. So we cordoned off that 10-day period of time before the Super Bowl, 2 days after the Super Bowl. And we started to look at keywords within our system. One of the things with the Super Bowl activity, unlike the initial work that we did around human trafficking years before, we looked for keywords. And our hook that we used for the Super Bowl is we used adult entertainment businesses and transactions that occurred within those adult entertainment businesses. So we were able to very quickly pull all of that data. We did all of this manually. We were able to pull all of that data and begin to slice and dice and filter that data. What we would see is we would see a lot of Uber activity, a lot of hotel activity. We would see people coming in from other areas. We would see phone numbers that were used in these adult ads, now used in Minneapolis, previously used in, let's say, California or something like that. So during that event, what we tried to do is we tried to work in as near real time as possible. We had about 10 people on the project. Again, we were working with the task force at the time. And we explained to them in the very beginning, the suspicious activity report that you're going to get from us is going to look a little different than the suspicious activity report that you would typically get. Typically, a suspicious activity report will, first you have the alert generated, which can take about 30 days for a team to work that alert, and then move to a case. Can take about another 60 days for that case to be worked. You can be waiting 90 days before something like that got into the hands of law enforcement. What we tried to do it within 3 or 4 days. So our information, again, may not have been as robust as some of the longer term SARS, but we would get the information into their hands as quickly. Our goal was to get the information into their hands as quickly as we could, so they can act on it. Just so happened the first case that we stumbled on, just so happened that an individual had 6 ATM cards. And with those 6 ATM cards, he provided each one of the girls who was working for him an ATM cards, and they would make deposits into the ATM on a regular basis. Because we were acting in near real time, we were able to also get film and watch the transactions take place, capture the film, see everything that we needed to see. During that event, we made 76 referrals to law enforcement. During that event, law enforcement made 93 arrests in total. Many of them were a result of some of the referrals that we had made. Since that time, we've worked on a number of Super Bowls since then. None were as successful for us because obviously that was our footprint of customers. But I think Bill's going to talk in a little bit about how he took this same model and he worked it into the World Series. I'm sorry, the All-Star game, the baseball All-Star game in Cleveland, and did the same type of thing in his area. I think we're going to hold questions to the end, but Dan, back to you.
Yes, I know, Phil, we could have probably spent another hour just on your portion. So thank you for giving us the abbreviated version, because it certainly is a compelling use case. But I do want to make sure we allow time for Bill. So our next presenter is Bill Cloninger. Bill has been a senior investigator in KeyBank's AML investigations unit since 2005. The second career follows more than 20 years of wide-ranging banking managerial experience with Wells Fargo, Crocker National Bank, Western States Bank Card Association, and Bracton Corporation, which is a merchant banking and private equity firm from the UK-based clearing bank, Midland Bank. Bill is the founder and co-chairman of the ACAMS Northern Ohio chapter, which began in 2014. The chapter was awarded ACAMS Chapter of the Year in 2017. ACAMS honored Bill in 2016 by naming him ACAMS Professional of the Month. Outside of banking, Bill is a world and U.S. national record-setting hot air balloon pilot and avid bicyclist. So, Bill, I'd like to turn it over to you if you could please provide us some details on what happened during the MLB All-Star Game.
Okay, basically what I'm going to tell you, I'm standing on the shoulders of Phil Deluca. His work blazed the trail and we just followed it. Back in January of 2019, I got the notion that we've got the All-Star Game coming up, so we need to do something about it to see if we can find the financial activity and get it to law enforcement in a very timely, quick manner. So the first thing I did, I called Phil and said, "Hey, Phil, how'd you do this?" And he walked me through it and then put me in touch with some folks at a company called Systematrix. And they're a system database firm, and they have web crawlers out there looking for sex ads 24/7. And they have a database of 5 to 7 million, depending on who you talk to at Systematrix. And we said, okay, what we want to do is see current ads that they have found that have Cleveland, Canton, Akron, or Youngstown in the ad, someplace. And then we will take that list and the phone number or email address off of the list and run it against our full customer database, see if we get any hits. And then if we do, we'll assign that to, we'll have a clerk put together an alert, assign it to an investigator, and then generate a SAR, get it through our QC process, and file the SAR hopefully within that day, and then hand deliver the SAR to the Cuyahoga County Human Trafficking Task Force, which is headed up at the Sheriff's Department. So that was when we started. We said, let's see if we can do this. Systematrix was very helpful. Then I started meeting with the folks at the Sheriff's Department and say, this is what we want to do for this very short period of time and see if we can make it work. Internally, we put together a task force that had about 10 to 15 people involved in it, including folks from investigations and our compliance people. Also, we had the lawyers involved and most importantly, the programming staff, because we had to be able to take an Excel spreadsheet of names and ads and phone numbers and be able to run it against our customer database. So with that, and we also had the partners at Systematrix and the county task force. So when we started to run this is the sort of our plan, and it was very similar to Phil's 10-day plan. We would run a run of the sex ad database every day, starting 10 days or so before the All-Star Game, which was on July 9th. And we would run that early in the morning. That would be run at about 5:30 to 6 in the morning, and we'd have the list. It would be handed to the programming staff, and they would run it against our database and see if we had any hits, and we'd have those back by 7 in the morning. Then those would be assigned to one specific analyst who would input the information and create the alert in our case management system. By 9 o'clock in the morning, that those cases that came from the alerts would be handed to an investigator, and they had 3 hours to do their investigation, to come up with, is this real or is it a false positive, and write the report. It would then go through our QC process and be ready for filing by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which is when we at KeyBank do our SAR filing. And then soon as it was filed, I would be given paper copies of the SARs, and I would drive down to the Justice Center and hand deliver the SARs to the task force leaders. And that's the way the thing worked. We had to get our compliance people and our attorneys to agree with a shortened, streamlined SAR write-up, and we had to get the QC people, everybody, to realize that this had to be done in a very short period of time. When we first started testing it in April, we got one run that we got 200 ads that had Cleveland and Canton, Akron, and Youngstown in them. When that was just as a test to see if it worked, and we ran that list against our database, and we didn't have any hits. So we had to salt some live stuff into so the programmers could make sure their programming worked. When we started at the end of June, started running it, the first run we had over 1,700 instead of 200, 1,700 ads with Cleveland, Canton, Akron, and Youngstown in them. So it said, okay, wow, the commercial sex industry has just arrived in town. We would run that against our database. We ended up, our numbers are not very big because we're not one of the major national, or multinational banks. We're a reasonable sized regional bank. We ended up with we had a total of 20 hits in the whole time we were monitoring this. And off of that, we ended up filing 17 SARs. But we also were giving to law enforcement the whole ad list. And what they did was they took that and they took some of their members from the sheriff's department and local law enforcement, and they created basically a calling house. And they would take that list and they would start dialing for dates and then they would go and arrest people. I was told at the end of it all, we ended up shutting down 7 massage parlors, and they told me we had about 105 arrests. That with the numbers that we got earlier, that sort of doesn't jive with the other numbers. So I'm not sure what the real number was, because I just was using what the heads of the task force told me. So everybody was very happy about it, and that's what we did. Looking to future major events that might bring the sex industry back to Cleveland, we're starting to look at the NBA All-Star game for March of next year. And so if any of you folks that work for financial institutions in the AML space here in Cleveland, if you would like to join up with us in this, please give me a call in the fall when we start planning how we're going to do the second run of this type of activity. And that's pretty much what I've got. Dan?
All right. Thank you so much, Bill,
Sure.
for that great information. We do have some questions, so maybe if we have all of our panelists maybe available, we'll run through some questions that we had that we're holding to the end, if that's all right. So maybe this is one we'll take first. Does ethnicity discrimination in hiring play a role in legally entering the U.S., contribute to the U.S. being one of the top 3 countries with labor trafficking? Or maybe Angel or Maya.
That's a tough one. You know, I can opine on it. I don't know that there are any stats, Maya, unless you have anything specifically. You know, I don't know. I mean, I think it could be a contributing factor. I think it's that, you know, I haven't seen any studies specifically that tell us one way or the other. It's an interesting question. I would like to look into that.
Okay, great. I don't know if Maya had a comment on that. Okay, let's move on. Maybe we have a couple more questions. Has FinCEN or any other regulator levied any fines of consequence that have spurred the financial sector to do more against the business of human trafficking?
I could take that. You know, I'm not aware of FinCEN levying any fines specifically for human trafficking or banks not looking for human trafficking. I think all of this is lumped into the suspicious activity, and of course, banks are always being looked at for doing the right thing in the suspicious activity field. Specifically, human trafficking, I'm not aware of that.
Okay, well, maybe this is maybe a twist on that. Is there a way to identify culprits of human trafficking using synthetic currency, Bill, or anyone actually?
Yes, actually there is. A lot of people think that virtual currency is anonymous. It's not. That's one thing. But what I will say, still in the trafficking space, cash is king. We still see more cash activity than anything else in that area.
Okay. Anyone else want to comment on that? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, completely agree. But I think in one of the kind of biggest online investigations, if people have followed Backpage at all, that was purely based on, you know, well, not purely, a big kind of aha moment and break in that case was through the use of virtual currency being leveraged to purchase ads. There were patterns that we were able to, I wasn't involved, but the law enforcement was able to detect and identify and hold ultimately Backpage accountable.
Thank you, Angel. We'll move on to the next question. Are you finding an increase in human trafficking in light of the pandemic? For example, are you finding that populations of homeless and dislocated people are being victimized by their need to exist in seemingly safer environments in which there may not be at such a high risk of getting COVID? I don't know if we've seen an increase in human trafficking in light of the COVID pandemic.
Dan, from our perspective at KeyBank, we haven't seen that.
Okay. I don't know, Phil, did you, anything in your perspective, Phil, in light of the
No,
COVID pandemic?
nothing in particular. Honestly, since the pandemic, we have not run any of our human trafficking filters.
Okay. Another question we have is Phil and Bill's methodology used in other jurisdictions and at other major events?
And Dan, before you answer that question, I know there may be people who need to get off right at 7:30. So I'm going to actually share my screen and post the CLE activity number. But we will continue to answer questions as long as people need. So go ahead, and I'm actually having a technical issue here, so I will work this out while you continue to answer questions.
No worries, Kathy. We'll just wait for you to post that. So the question was, is the methodology you guys use, Phil and Bill, is it used in other jurisdictions and other public events?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And it's not just used for human trafficking. What we've done is we've used this for opioid trafficking. We've used this for terrorist financing. We've used this for arms trafficking. If you recall the steps that I had walked through earlier in my presentation, human trafficking is just one typology that we use this for. We used it for many. And as you can see from the conversation that I had with Bill, we were very open to anyone who asked us any of the hows. We gave him, we tried to be as open with our peers as open as we possibly could be.
Thank you.
If I could add, with Key Bank, our footprint goes all across the northern tier of the United States. And we've been looking at trying to find major events that would draw the sex trade into town. And we have a number here in Cleveland, but we're all equipped and ready to go to any of our other major cities where we have a major presence, but we just haven't had the events that would be the carrot that draws them into town.
And I think the most recent type of major events that this type of methodology has been leveraged for is sporting events, but also political events. So a lot of the conventions, I mentioned Polaris earlier, really looking to connect banks to topologies and information and data related to the political events that happened over the past couple of years.
Yeah, we've talked about internally about the NFL draft, which will be held in Cleveland the end of April, early May, but we decided not to do anything because we think COVID-19 issues are enough to keep the sex industry and keep their customers out of town.
There's another question maybe for you, Bill. Does KeyBank use this method against fake medical products and drugs?
No, we haven't.
No?